This work from our group was based largely on the work by Emma Doran, who's a PhD student who wasn't able to come and present, so I'm presenting her work and the work of the group. So working with ultra-high field strengths gives quite a lot of potential opportunities. So there's intrinsic higher signal to noise and greater contrast to noise, in part because with much longer T1s you get better background suppression of signal, even at quite low flip angles, while the signal in the vessel remains the same, and so there's an intrinsic increase in contrast to noise ratio. We wanted to look at the very small vessels in the abdomen, which proves to be quite challenging. The initial work at 70 was largely done on neuroimaging in extremity, in part because of the small field of view, but also because in the early days the initial coils that were manufactured or produced was quite limited, and certainly started with neurocoils. And you can see, I haven't got is there a pointer? Aha, okay, thank you. So you can see clearly the difference in the peripheral vessels in neuroimaging, and you could use head coils to put extremities for imaging, and this is the work that we did and presented here back in 2006 with imaging of the hand vessels and showed increases in spatial resolution. There are issues with 70, largely due to field inhomogeneities and issues on SAR deposition. And as I say, that those are benefits, they are less for the neuro and extremities, but there are some serious challenges in the abdomen. This is in part because as you increase the Lamore frequency, the length of the RF pulse becomes much, frequency it becomes less, and it becomes less than your normal torso. So you're looking at 11, 12 centimeters, and not many people are quite that thin. And this creates both destructive and constructive interference, and that becomes quite problematic as you go to larger fields of view. You also have increased SAR deposition, and in particular you get hotspots with SAR deposition, partly due to the constructive interference effects and also partly to do with the issues to do with local coils. Always in the abdomen there are motion problems, and to get ideal vessel imaging you want breath hold imaging, which is challenging. And you can see here on this T1 weighted scan, these are areas of destructive interference causing problems. So really, even though it took a while to get abdominal coils, but these really weren't solving the problems, and technology needed to move ahead. And the real game changer for the abdomen came with development of parallel transmit technology, which is basically using multiple coils, multiple surface array coils, and these can be modified so you can actually adjust the individual B1 fields. You can adjust the magnitude and phase of each of the fields across the coils, and you can see here the effect. And because you can alter both the spatial and temporal control, you can reduce the B1 inhomogeneity, you can reduce the SAR, although in some ways part of that is just actually modifying the SAR, so you can move the destructive interference effects away from the area you're most interested in and move the constructive effects perhaps into where you want increased signal. And I think you can see the improvement in field inhomogeneity between the standard coil and the parallel transmit technology. And this really opened up the field for body imaging at 7 Tesla. People have been exploiting this, and there's been work done on the liver and kidneys. There are opportunities for increased vascular information because of the contrast to noise effects, and it does enable one to do unenhanced imaging, which certainly as a clinician, there are advantages in that it's repeatable, so the radiographers and technologists are perhaps happier and less concerned that they'll get the contrast in the timing wrong. But in the research field, it's so much easier if you can have a subject in the scanner and keep doing repetitive scans. We used to do that using gadophosphoset, and obviously now that that isn't used, the ability to do research with unenhanced imaging is actually quite significant. And while the much of the work has been, certainly in the renals, has been in the main vessels and main intrarenal vessels, much of chronic renal disease is based on the very small imagings out here and at the corticomedullary junction. And there's also some work considering that they may be an early indicator of end organ damage in hypertension. So there is an interest in looking at these very small vessels. But up until now, really at the lower field strengths, even at 3 Tesla, it hasn't been possible to look at these images. And so this is really where we were focused. So Emma in particular worked on producing a multi-echo 2D time of flight protocol. We used Sense to enable breath hold imaging, but obviously that has a penalty in signal to noise. We were compelled to have a long TR due to the T1 effects at 70 and the SAR limits. And so she exploited this to put in multiple echoes. Actually work that I think Dumoulin described back in the 80s, but this enables the summing of signal to regain some of the signal to noise lost otherwise, and it helps us look at these very small vessels. So these are the parameters, and you can clearly see that there's significant decay, T2 decay. However, there is still signal there, and if you can use that, then that does benefit the ability to look at these very small vessels. And hopefully you can see that there's certainly a loss of, the noise has improved, and we are seeing, I don't know how well it projects, but we do get better detail of the smaller vessels. So for instance, you can see a little better here than you can over there. Looking at MIPS from the data, we can see and quantify that there is increased signal. And it's very pixelated and doesn't actually project that well, but just as an example, we're hoping that we can demonstrate that you are seeing these vessels. Perhaps it actually looks better on the non-blown up image. We're seeing them right out to the periphery. And hopefully this will prove of clinical utility. We've begun to look at certain other areas in the liver. The ability to look at the network connectivity is thought to be a predictor of the severity of potential portal hypertension. And my time is going off, so I better stop. Also my own interest in working with deep inferior epigastric perforated small vessels in the abdomen, which are used for post-mastectomy breast reconstruction, and to see whether that was possible. And here we see in the liver, we are seeing the vessels right out, and they're better in the summed. And initial work on the DEP imaging. This is obviously an axial image, and these are the rectus muscle, and this is the deep inferior epigastric artery with the small perforator coming off. And these are extraordinary images for me because they are beautiful and yet they're unenhanced and they're very small. And I spend a lot of time looking at 1.5 Tesla of enhanced vessels, and again, you're seeing coming through the fat, and again, the intramuscular course. We hope to be able to look at the arteriovenous connections. So really, the advent of the parallel transmit has been a game changer for the abdominal imaging at 7 Tesla. And using this multi-echo image, we are beginning to look at very small peripheral vessels and hope that we can exploit that to improve it and move into looking at it more clinically as well as in other fields. Thank you.